Reptiles have steadily grown in popularity over the last couple of years thanks to plenty of content creators dedicated to sharing their experiences and educating the public on just how amazing of a community reptiles can form, even when we don't always agree. But what goes on in the reptile world when the cameras aren't on? Well, this video may shed some light on the darker parts of the reptile industry based on my experience with Creatures Plus Rhode Island. The biggest question we ask ourselves as reptile keepers is, are we keeping them correctly? Dave Kaufman has an entire series of videos dedicated to finding out. Well, to start to answer that, we need to assess some of the repercussions faced by improper husbandry. The lack of UVB lighting and calcium availability can lead to MBD, or metabolic bone disease. To state the obvious, lack of food or water can lead to starvation or dehydration. Prolonged exposure to excessive humidity will cause respiratory infections. The list goes on and on. So where did Creatures Plus go wrong? Well, let's start by taking a look at some of their enclosures. First off, we've got a dying Oscar in a 210-gallon aquarium with an arowana, a pacu, and an alligator gar. Not super uncommon to see. Next, we've got a Midas cichlid with what seems to be some missing scales and a dead red-tailed catfish in the background. And then there's this tank. With this much algae in the tank, the nitrate and ammonia levels must be skyrocketing, not to mention how harmful it could be to bag up one of these fish for a customer. Even the smallest amount of water left in the fish bag will contain traces of this algae and spread throughout the customer's tank at home. An unexperienced keeper will not realize this, and the situation will very quickly escalate. On top of the algae in this tank, we've got an outstanding amount of fish, some that can't even be seen with how thick the algae is. We've got at least 2 red-tailed catfish, 2 Oscars, and an alligator gar, and that's just what we see up front. Who knows what other fish are hiding in the background. This problem can be solved fairly quickly with the big water chains and a UV filtration system, something that Creatures Plus themselves sell to the public. Now we've got a ferret alone in a small cage. Ferrets are extremely social animals and require lots of attention and lots of stimulants to keep them busy. What we see here is outrageous and similar to that of a puppy mill. This ferret has been left alone in a small environment with nothing but a ball, a food dish, and a water bottle. On top of this, the walls of this cage are clearly unkept and are building up excess dirt. And finally, for the non-reptile related portion of these enclosures, we have their axolotls. Here you can see me feeling the tank to check the temperature, and as you might expect, it was warm to the touch. Axolotls not only thrive in, but require much cooler water than most aquatic species. Anything close to or above room temperature will quickly kill your axolotl. And this is exactly what happened. What we have here seems to be a human centipede lineup of tadpole corpses. Not for sale. Yeah, I would seriously hope not. If there was one frame to sum up this video, this might be a decent contender. Some of the tadpoles were still alive, if you want to use that word, but you could see the conditions they're living in, and I don't expect them to live much longer. Above the tadpoles, it would seem they at least had the sense to separate the axolotls that made it through the tadpole stage, and while these tanks are far cleaner comparatively, they're still at an unacceptable quality of life. And now we're going to move on to a few of the reptile enclosures they had available. To start, we've got 3 juvenile iguanas cramped in a small terrestrial enclosure with nothing but a water dish. We've got a redfoot tortoise with just enough floor space to turn around. Next up are the filthy tegu enclosures. At this point, it's not even worth pointing out the size. I'm just more curious how a tank with repticarpet gets to that level of grime. Then we've got this enclosure divided into multiple segments housing multiple types of reptiles, including fat-tailed geckos, baby bearded dragons, cohabbed in that small of a space, and even a Solomon Island ground boa with a dried-out water dish and a fair amount of dead crickets just stuck to the bottom. Then we've got a tank housing both wood turtles and a Russian tortoise, 2 species with completely different care requirements. Extremely small turtle tanks, even for a temporary tank in a pet shop, with the one on top actually having not 1 but 2 turtles and the one below it just in need of a water change. Here's a white line gecko with nothing but a tiny water dish. Not even so much as a single branch was given. And this singular juvenile bearded dragon who seems to have been given the biggest enclosure in the reptile room. Not to mention it's a mostly arboreal enclosure. This just has me wondering why the bearded dragon was given this, but the 3 iguanas were given the much smaller, completely terrestrial tank right below it. It just makes no sense. So that's all I'm going to show for this segment, as the other enclosures all really had the same issues. Either they were too small or too dirty, or both. Clearly the mindset here is just to throw the reptiles in whatever slot is available and just barely keep them alive until they're sold. And with that, we're going to move on to the overall cleanliness of the store. First, we've got an extremely filthy station in the reptile room, what seems to be just a trash corner next to this koi pond. A few heavily used tanks, one with a broken door and another filled with colored sand and dead crickets, directly underneath all of their products, food, and unused tanks. On the other side, we've got an absolutely filthy screen cage next to a small glass enclosure, also used and home to a spider. And oh boy, were the spiders an issue in this store. Most of the corners and empty spaces were encompassed by spider webs. This one next to the ferret cage is doing a real nice job of collecting all of the fallen aspen. A grimy fish maintenance station next to it, and almost all of the floors look like this. Just wet and unkept, even in areas where there weren't fish. Where there wasn't water, there was substrate or just dirt and dust collecting, even in areas where there weren't animals. At least they put out a wet floor sign, I guess. So now you're thinking, well, this is all pretty common practice at pet and especially reptile shops, right? Well, yeah, that's kind of the point. Although I'm focusing on Creatures Plus, this video is meant to be an example of how tons of pet shops actually function. Creatures Plus just happened to be the shop that I walked into and decided to film. And here it is, the clip I've been saving for this point in the video. The clip that made me decide to make this video in the first place. The breaking point, if you will. And now is where I warn you to skip ahead if you don't want to see this. So here we've got a paludarium set up housing 2 adult Cuban Knight anoles and at least 1 baby. Now, Cuban Knights aren't exactly known for their communal attitudes. Quite the opposite, actually. They're known to fight and even cannibalize each other given the chance, so you can see where this is heading. Taking a closer look at the first adult here, and he's not looking the best. He's quite thin and has a case of nose rub, usually from stress, and a nipped but regrown tip of the tail. The baby seems to be going through a pretty rough shed. And here's how the water feature is looking. Yeah, it seems to be just the 1 tetra. You'll also notice this tank seems to be pretty dry. There is, of course, the water feature, but with the screen top, I can't imagine how much humidity it's really adding. The sides of the glass have gone completely dry, implying that these guys don't get misted at all, or if so, not often. Cuban Knights are supposed to have a humidity upwards of 80%, but as you can see here, even the moss is dried out. As I began walking away from the enclosure, my girlfriend, who was with me at the time, sounded shocked. I quickly moved back to the enclosure, and this is what I saw. I've added a blur to this part of the video because it's pretty hard to watch. So within a few seconds, the baby anole was dead. You could see the clip ends as I put down the camera and readied to open the enclosure, but by the time I had stopped recording, it was already too late. Combine the speed of the kill with the shock delay, and there wasn't much more to be done. So I recorded my last clip of the enclosure and the dead lizard inside of it, and we left the store. It was that moment I decided I had to make this video. Part of me wishes I would have stayed in the store grabbing more clips and examples of the poor conditions, but I had to walk out. So what you see in this video is essentially all I had recorded up until that point. It's at this point of the video that I think we should reset the momentum. You must be thinking, well, it can't all be bad. And you're right. So I'd like to take a moment to look over all the positive aspects of the store. Some of the fish tanks they had were pretty impressive. This stingray was beautiful and seemed to be well taken care of. While most of the fish tanks were still pretty dirty and in need of better filtration, a lot of the fish seemed fairly healthy. Like this porcupine puffer, who was stunning even given the difficult care requirements. Not to mention this arapaima and arowana setup. I mean, the two of these fish were gorgeous and seemed to be in great condition. The arowana had a bit of eye drop, which is fairly hard to avoid, but other than that, seemed to have a very clean and untouched scales. I'd consider both of these fish to be in pretty decent condition. Moving on to their inventory, you'll see that there's actually a good selection of products, especially from a general pet store's reptile section. Normally reptiles receive a small corner in the back of the store with only the essentials, but that isn't the case here. You've got tons of decor and food options and even a wide array of enclosures to choose from. Although I didn't get to record it due to having leaving so suddenly, the other sections of the store were about the same. Not the cleanest for sure, but they did have practically everything you might need for whatever pet you have. It was definitely a nice surprise. So let's gather all that we know and go over it with a little more detail. I want to start by saying that this was my second time visiting Creatures Plus, the first one being about a year beforehand. This is a pretty important detail because apparently during that year there was a change in management. The first time I visited, none of these problems were apparent, and that's exactly why I wanted to go back. Boy, was I disappointed. Oh, and I definitely wasn't the only one. There were plenty of reviews stating the disgust most of the customers felt. So, coming back to Dave Kaufman, his channel is full of great tours of the best reptile shops all around the world. What Dave does with those videos is so important for the reptile community and for the storefronts that are truly dedicated to improving the reptile industry. That being said, no one touches upon all that's wrong with the rest of the stores, at least for privately owned stores. We all know how much reptile content creators hate big chains like Petco or PetSmart. I made this video not just to drag Creatures Plus through the mud, but to use them as an example of what's going on more often than not. There are plenty of pet shops running way worse than this, and it seems to be that no one's talking about it. We need to open the eyes of the community to what's actually going on out there. This video is more than just exposing one bad shop. It's a call to action to do better. The future of the reptile industry depends on it. So, that's all I got for now. Any clips that I use will have a link in the description to the full videos along with the on-screen credits during those clips. Thank you all so much for watching if you did. I'd really appreciate it if you left a thumbs up and shared this video with a friend. Hopefully we can continue to strive for better.